Today I am joined by Oscar Davies, an award-winning barrister at Garden Court Chambers and a leading figure in public and human rights law. Oscar is recognised as the first publicly acknowledged non-binary barrister in the UK and has been a trailblazer in representing trans and non-binary clients across various civil and public law sectors. Oscar's work as a barrister is a gateway to their activism in trans issues and climate-related strategic litigation. Beyond their courtroom successes, Oscar is currently writing a book, which we talk about a little bit, on non-binary recognition, exploring how the law can better reflect and dismantle stigmas around gender, sex, binary. I hope everyone enjoys this episode as much as I did recording it. Oscar offers some really inspiring but extremely practical advice for anyone who might consider the bar. They also share the gaps and absences when it comes to protection for non-binary or trans people, which is really important. I learned a lot from this episode and it was a pleasure to speak with Oscar. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of Activist Lawyer. I am absolutely delighted to be joined via Zoom and from London by Oscar Davies. Hello Oscar.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We've been in touch a little bit and I have to say I'm so excited to talk about your work and grateful to have you here to share your experience and your thoughts on something that we haven't really discussed on the podcast in any great detail. But first, I'm going to go back in time a little bit and ask you about who or what inspired you to pursue a career in law, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, of course. It was actually a combination of what job I could do with the skills that I had. So I was always doing music stuff at school. So I played clarinet, sing, cello. I was always doing all of the rehearsals all the time. I was such a nerd, really. But I also was doing performances 3 times a week. And so I have this performance background, which I do think is relevant to the law. And then on the other side, I was always into my academics and I studied history and French from my undergrad, for example. I think that kind of brain test intellectual side was always interesting. So I thought, what can I combine these two things with? I think probably popular culture influenced it to some extent, but not so much that I remember a particular character or something. So then I considered, okay, what can I do with this? And actually I thought maybe I'll be a diplomat because then I can travel and have a glam life.
Yeah.
But then I thought maybe be a journalist because that also seemed interesting. And then barrister was like my main other option. And it just transpired that I was like, okay, let's try and do this. And I was never sure if I was going to make it because as your listeners probably know, it's very difficult. But I guess I've made it to some extent because I'm here. So.
You're here and you're talking to us today and we're excited to look at some of your work. And we'll also talk about some of the challenges you face down the line. But just in terms of your work, what kind of practice? I know you're with Garden Court Chambers and we're very lucky to have had quite a few guests from Garden Court Chambers. What does your work generally entail?
Yeah, so I moved to Garden Court in December 2023, and my practice is a bit of a mixture of civil law. So one of my main areas is employment law. So this is discrimination, unfair dismissal, things like that, based on protected characteristics. I also do broader discrimination cases outside of the employment tribunal. There is then education work, which I do. So this includes school exclusions, things like that, and also public law, which is judicial review. I'm also public access qualified. So I often, because I have a background in kind of international law, I often get international law side, instructions. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is interesting.
Just as well as the first publicly acknowledged non-binary barrister in the UK, you represent trans and non-binary clients across various civil public law sectors. How did you get into this line of work, and is that a difficult area to specialise in, or is it a growing area in terms of getting work in those cases?
Yeah, it's a good question. I got into it a bit by accident because when I got tenancy at my old chambers, Lamb Chambers, basically there was this case called Taylor and Jaguar Land Rover, which came out, which was a first instance decision in the Employment Tribunal, which was the first one that said non-binary or gender fluid could fall under the gender reassignment part of the Equality Act. So it's basically, that's usually what a trans person uses if they've been discriminated against. And I'd done a kind of in-depth article about this case earlier that year. And I'd put my pronouns and so my chambers knew that I was non-binary. So when I got tenancy, the head admin person was like, "Oh, you know, everyone has Mr., Dr., Miss, Ms., etc. What do you want yours to be?" And then I was like, "Oh, well, I could have MX because MX is the gender neutral version of say Mr. And you pronounce it like mix, which is like pick a mix, which I always say. Sometimes say to judges in court and then they look at me bemused. And yeah, so that's kind of how it started. And then I just done a tweet being like, I was just proud to have got tenancy, to be honest, because as we'll come to discuss, it was a tempestuous journey, you could say.
Okay.
And so basically I got tenancy, did a tweet being like, maybe this is illegal first because I've not seen an MX on a board before. And then Legal Cheek got it and they were like, legal first, da da da. And then Catherine Baxi at the Times did a piece and then Reuters did a piece. So it kind of became a bit of a funny news item, but without really intending it to be from my side. And then I considered that I should kind of use the momentum. And so I created my Instagram called @nonbinarybarrister, where I kind of make resources for trans non-binary people. So I get a lot of inquiries and work through that. And, I talk on panels and this and that, and people are probably tired of hearing me talk. But this is basically where it originated from. And I've just been rolling with it ever since.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting into some of those cases, but just to mention, and I am going to mention these, you're quite early in your career and you've already, you have an impressive list of awards. One award, LGBTQ plus Champion of the Year, and you were also nominated for the DE&I Rising Star of the Year at the same award, as well as top 10 outstanding contributions to LGBTQ plus life. And a big one, which is you were covered in the Evening Standard magazine as one of the unsung heroes of the LGBTQ plus community. So you're kind of, really doing a lot in terms of promoting, I guess, the gaps in the law and the work that needs to be done to represent the LGBTQ plus community. And I'm wondering if you're able to share, I suppose, some of the issues that are coming forward in your work that would affect the community and how your work is helping to deal with that and the challenges that they present.
Yeah. No, it's funny with the awards because I have to say, I never really thought I would win an award in a legal space because I guess I have a kind of unusual background and I come at it from a slightly different angle. So I was always, I'm very humbled to have won and been nominated for these awards. In terms of the work, I mean, there's so much work to be done. I think we can obviously always be a bit complacent when it comes to at least LGB rights. I think everyone knows that trans rights are in the center of some sort of culture war, which we have to tread quite carefully around and through. I think that, LGB people have to not take their rights for granted because I think they're the next ones to be pulled back. If, say, trans rights are being pulled back, then LGBT rights will also be pulled back. And I think that, solidarity has to be had with trans and non-binary siblings, for example, but also more broadly, I think there are real challenges even outside of there. For example, in the UK, we don't have non-binary legal recognition, which I think we'll come on to talk about. Yeah. And this is only speaking within the UK. Outside the UK, there are still several countries that ban homosexuality, for example. I know that at the moment in the UK, there's work to be done to try and ban conversion therapy. So if listeners don't know what conversion therapy is, it's basically when you try and tell someone that they're not the sexuality or gender that they say they are or that they say they intend to be. And at the moment, it's not been banned. So alleged therapists can still try and do these practices, even though the UN has said these practices are torture. So there's some clear difficulties here. And I think like every government in the last 10 years has tried to has said they're going to put a conversion therapy ban in place, but then they haven't done it. So, you know, there needs to be some more kind of, focused work on that. But I mean, that's really just a surface level snapshot of some of the issues, because I think they are really deep seated in terms of, you know, race, class, like everything is overlapping and intersectional. So it's all very well me sitting here saying this as like a white privileged person, you know, who's like perceived as male in most contexts. So I understand my privilege, but at the same time, I kind of consider like if I can do some work to help those after me who are coming through the system who are non-binary or trans, then at least I can use my privilege in a beneficial way for them. So so that's important. Kind of the way that I see it.
I mean, that intersectional approach is important, and I know that that's how you approach your work. But just, I mean, the discrimination faced, and I'll talk about people who identify as non-binary, is, I mean, it must affect them on every level, from access to healthcare. And I read a couple of cases, and I don't think the outcomes were that positive in the UK, even around issuing passports, and the difficulty that seems to have thrown up. But how people must feel so, I don't know, vulnerable. And it's, you know, important to have someone like you and your colleagues as well who are pushing this through on a legal level, but also from the perspective of activism, which we'll look at as well. Can you talk about any instances where there is an absence of kind of robust protections for transgender individuals or people who identify as non-binary that kind of stand out at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think... Just before I answer that question, just in terms of like the non-binary thing in general, I think the difficulty is because our society is so entrenched in just thinking that the binary is norm and that the binary is the only thing, meaning just like man, woman, then there's nothing else in between. I think it means that the struggle that non-binary people face, as opposed to say trans women or trans man, is potentially more insidious in that it's more nuanced and more hidden. And so, you know, people just don't take non-binary people seriously. And some people will be listening to this and they'll be like, oh, who's this idiot, like woke person, like nattering on about this and that. And I'm like, that's all very well, but you've never had, for example, a dissonance between your sex, which you've been assigned, and your gender, which you've been assigned. Whereas I can say like, my gender doesn't align with my sex, but it's not all the way onto the other end of the spectrum. So I know for a fact, unless I'm completely deranged, which I don't think I am, you know, I know for a fact that there is something in between. And I can only say that from my personal experience. And then also, you know, reading about like other identities in other places. You know, you have like Two-Spirit, like Indigenous American, you have Hijra in India. And whilst they're not exactly the same as non-binary, I think the point is that they've been around for centuries kind of thing. To answer your actual question, which was about the gaps for like non-binary protections, there are a few things that spring to mind immediately. One of the most obvious ones is like the discrimination protection. So currently, if you're non-binary and you have been discriminated against, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to successfully bring a court case, because it's not written into any legislation at the moment in the UK. I think there's an act coming through in Scotland. It's a Crime and Disorder Act or something, but that does actually mention non-binary for the first time. But yeah, I mean, it's not in the Equality Act, for example, even though it's been read in by the Taylor and Jaguar case, but that's only a first instance decision. So it's quite fragile, I would say. And my point is that non-binary people can't be truly protected. Say, for example, I disclosed that I was non-binary and I was going for a job. And then all of a sudden, when I made that disclosure, I didn't get the job. Like in Equality Act terms, if non-binary was just like trans man or something, you could probably bring in a victimization and discrimination claim, whereas it's not super clear if you can do that with non-binary. So I think that's a good example. And also, I mean, there's so much, I think, we have to talk about the online angle as well. And there's a lot of harassment online and this and that. And it's like, until the government actually like recognizes that non-binary is real, which I think they're kind of toing and froing about, which is bizarre because like there's at least 50 in other countries which do recognize it. Yeah. I think it's going to be difficult for it to be kind of taken seriously by people. I think people just assume that it's like millennials or Gen Z is like trying to be unique and this and that, but that's just not the point. And I think if people realize how hard it was to be publicly non-binary and for people to question everything you do, I just don't think they would have that attitude.
So we're really far behind, and it is interesting to see how far ahead some jurisdictions are, and it'll be interesting to monitor the development of this area of the law, which of course you've written about extensively. We'll get to that just in a moment, but I know pro bono work is a big part of your practice. How or why, how important is it for you to do pro bono work in your particular line of work, and how's that going for you?
I think it's really important. The caveat is that I think there is a few valid arguments on why we shouldn't have to do pro bono work, meaning, you shouldn't have to do unpaid work for your time, etc. And like everyone should be able to access some sort of justice, whether it's like legal aid or something else. But no, for me, I know that the reality is that lots of people just don't have the means to like bring litigation, and therefore obviously there's an issue with access to justice. So yeah, I think for me, it's kind of like with pro bono, I want to help my community as much as I can. So this is usually like LGBTQ plus cases, although not exclusively. And a lot of the time, it's things that come through my Instagram or through friends of friends or whatever. Or if I really believe in a cause, then I might do it pro bono. And sometimes I end up taking on too much, and then I forget that I have to bill and live my life and pay my rent, which is always a risk. And I remember I think it was in April, I had such a busy January, February, March. And then in April, I ended up billing basically almost nothing because I had these 5 pro bono cases that I kept on doing. And then I was like, okay, I need to calm down a bit because this is, with all due respect, charity starts at home.
It's tricky to get that balance.
No, it is good though. And I think, when you get a good result for a client and you're doing it pro bono, obviously you feel like, okay, maybe I'll go to the good place finally. Maybe, after I'm dead, this is going to work out for me. But no, it is. I think pro bono is important. And I really encourage all barristers and lawyers as well to do some, because let's face it, lawyers probably get paid more than the average person. And it's for you to say you don't have any time to do some free work is just a lie. It's just you're being selfish with your money. So actually it's do some work for the community, whichever community that you feel part of. Yeah. Because, everyone has different organizations that they help and this and that. And it's I don't think I'm Mother Teresa in any sense, but at the same time, I'm very happy to do pro bono work because it kind of counterbalances the other stuff. And often the most interesting cases I've done have been pro bono. Yeah. Often, you probably had clients before who will say the most iconic cases I have done have pretty much all been pro bono, because those are kind of a lot of the ones that make, they make the precedents, and they're the ones that are quite risky, but what the client probably has a good case but can't get the funding. These are kind of the ones that make you stand out as well. So yeah, I would say if anyone can do, it's obviously not open to everyone because some areas are paid really poorly, and I understand that. But if you can do that, then yeah, I think definitely.
Yeah, I asked that question because it's a common trait that we do see in a lot of our guests who join us to talk about their work. Pro bono is a big feature, and I know organisations are trying to push it as well and encourage more barristers and solicitors to get involved, which is what you're doing. And what kind of cases have stood out for you? Is there any highlights or pivotal moments, whether through your pro bono work or otherwise, that you could zoom in on?
I think there's been a few. Yeah, there's definitely been a few cases. One of my first ever cases actually was representing an English nationalist in the Employment Tribunal on a belief claim. So the question is whether his belief can be protected or not. So it's really talking about the delineation between Article 9, which is freedom of thought or conscience, and then Article 10, freedom of expression, and then counterbalancing it with Article 17, which is like the destruction of rights. This is the European Convention on Human Rights. And that was one of my first ever cases that I got, and it's now been appealed. So we did the EAT earlier this year, and now we're doing Court of Appeal. So it's been super interesting because it's made me kind of become an expert on the belief cases, which then ties in with the trans and gender critical stuff, because the gender critical cases are kind of saying that like a gender critical point of view, which is like either sex matters or gender is not a thing, they basically say that that's a protected belief. So it's been quite interesting because that case has kind of informed like how I've become an expert on certain areas. And the belief stuff is really complicated and it's very nuanced. And it's also about the kind of social zeitgeist and compass wherever we are at that time. And, you know, how do the courts as arbiters of that social compass, even though they say they're not political, like they can't help it, but they probably are influenced to some extent by political events that unfold. And so it's quite interesting because I'm kind of doing the law on that and taking part in it. And yeah, kind of I'm asked to talk about these things all the time. So that's been one which is super interesting. Another one, which we appealed as well, was I was representing 3 care home workers who were dismissed from their care home job for not taking the vaccine. And this was before the government had introduced that regulation, which it did briefly, which said all care home workers have to have a vaccine unless you're exempt. So it was a pretty interesting case because it was talking about fairness of a dismissal in contrast with all of the ethical issues of should taking a vaccine be obligatory, your own bodily autonomy, your own beliefs, and if your belief in bodily autonomy should then protect you from that potentially discrimination. And also if you have religious beliefs against, say, for example, fetal cells being used in testing, whether that can also like stop you from being fired. So there was all these things in play. And actually for those 2 cases, I've been up against some quite formidable cases. So that was also interesting because it does feel a bit like David and Goliath at times when it's just like little old me representing the claimant. But yeah, it's definitely interesting stuff.
Definitely interesting stuff and a great experience as well. Now, we mentioned briefly your writing, and I have read some of your articles, which are really, really fascinating. You're working on something really interesting at the moment that you're going to publish soon, but also you're working on a book. A very novel and fresh book. Tell us about your book and what the content's about and when we can expect to see a bit more.
Yeah, so I'm writing a book. It kind of arose because last year I was approached by a publisher to write it. And they were like, oh, Oscar, we've seen your work. We think it's really fab. We think you could do a really interesting book in kind of non-binary and like your experience. So currently, the current iteration of the book is that I've finished the proposal, and basically it's, I don't think I'm allowed to give away the title yet because it might change, but I'll tell you what it's about. It's about, there's 2 purposes. One is to really, I'm kind of writing it for like your friend's dad, i.e. the non-converted. So like, you know, I want to explain what non-binary is, why it matters, why it's got material reality, and also why having non-binary legal and social recognition is important, and then the detriments that non-binary people face. For example, you mentioned passports earlier. So like non-binary people can't have a passport which represents their gender, at least in this country. And that was the Christie Land Kane case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Yeah, it basically mentions things like that. But then the second, potentially more interesting question, which is like a zoom out, is the argument that if everyone had a greater appreciation for genders beyond the binary, and if everyone kind of deconstructed their gender in a true and meaningful way, then this would benefit everyone, not just trans and non-binary people. So, for example, if there was, and the kind of whole idea is to break down this patriarchal idea of society that we're obviously still really entrenched in. So if gender was deconstructed and undone, I'm not saying that everyone has to like dye their hair cerulean blue and become non-binary, but it's more like a greater understanding and consciousness of how the binary traps all of us. And for example, like if that was done, then in my view, there would probably be fewer glass ceilings for women at work, potentially less domestic violence in the home, potentially less male suicide because they wouldn't be so restricted of like male stoicism, which is so ingrained into toxic masculinity. Like there's all these things which are kind of stereotypes, but they're also the embers of this patriarchal norm and binary structure that we live in. And so I guess my book is challenging that and kind of asking people to go deeper into how they consider their moving through space and how they consider their use of words and language and actions, where they could better challenge the binary, which perhaps is not considered by most to restrict them. But my argument is that it's more restrictive than you realize. Mm-hmm. And actually society would be better if we had a society which was not just gender binary, which I know, which I think I know that society doesn't have to be just restricted to gender binary, but I kind of want to explain it and get more people to be thinking outside of that restriction, because then that would have a trickle down effect in terms of how women are treated, how men or anyone else is treated. So that's kind of the idea.
Wow. I mean, it's an important book, I think, but also do you think that it might have an impact on addressing the absences in robust protections and legislation that we've addressed? Because, I mean, the way you've explained it there really identifies a whole kind of plethora of issues that feeds into this discussion. And if people were open to reading that and learning more, you know, it should become easier and clearer in terms of addressing these awful barriers that still exist.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the first point has to almost be people being a bit more open to receiving this idea of non-binary. And so that's why I would hope to kind of explain it in a human way. And this is like potentially why it's going through my lens. But yeah, I think also the kind of restrictions are there. And my point is, the book is also is for a lay person. It's not like a legal book. And I'm trying to, I think when probably other barristers on this podcast have had this, but a lot of the time with legal stuff is so dry and boring. Yeah. To get a lay person interested, you really have to go through many iterations of translation to try and get it to be readable. And that's kind of what I've been doing and toying with like over the period of writing this proposal, which is a good 15,000 word document. You know, it's not minimal. But yeah, I think that is to try and get legislation to be changed. So it's also a bit of a polemic book kind of thing. And actually, I'm writing this academic article at the moment, which is called Language as a Cage and a Tool, Unbinding the Binary in Legislation. And here I suggest ways that the legislature can basically change the law to make it more inclusive of non-binary stuff. Mm-hmm. So, for example, how would the Equality Act be amended if it was to include non-binary in the wording? Or what would we have to do with pension rights, for example? Or what would we do with passports? Like, there's all these kind of not random, but specific subcategories which are quite self-evidently like affect non-binary people. And yeah, so that's kind of the idea. I mean, I don't want to do all the work for the Parliament in terms of their drafting. Nope. But at the same time, it's like, if I can help to conceptualize some of these laws and rethink them from like a linguistic perspective, then, you know, I'm happy to do that. Yeah. I think because I studied French and history as my undergrad, it's like I always look at things through a linguistic frame. Like I did literature, language, da da da. So it's, you know, the first chapter of my book is all about language. So I think I guess as a lawyer, language is always important. This is kind of what you play with all the time. So it's important to be close to the language, but also to be understanding of, you know, what are the connotations of this word? What's the denotation of that word? Where are we socially? Like, what does this actually mean? And what's the effect of our words? You know, people say, what is it? Sticks and stones.
Sticks and stones will break
But
your
words will
bones.
never hurt me. But I actually, yeah, but words will never hurt me. But I think that's such a lie because, you know, these days, at least in the UK, like in a lot of circles, it's like we're arguing with our words all the time. And actually, these are the things that people complain about on Twitter and online, this harassment. Like it's the really damaging effect of pernicious words and like keyboard warrior type figures, which actually it's like, you know, a lot of the time because the internet and the social media sites are not super regulated, it's really hard to put something into hate speech. So then there's this weird in-between stage where it's like obviously really offensive and potentially attacks one of your protected characteristics, but you don't know what to do with it. So it's like, should I litigate this or should I report it to the social media company? Or yeah, I think people are really... it's kind of Wild West online, to be honest.
Yeah,
and I've been in the middle of some of it, and it's not anything I really am interested in being in the middle of.
No.
Like, do you know what I mean? I get paid to argue for a living. Like, if you want to argue with me, I'll send you an invoice. But apart from that, I'm not interested.
No, I think I totally agree. And I mean, for all the reasons you've just listed, I think now, I mean, language has never mattered more. And we're seeing the kind of toxicity, as you say, around even mainstream media and the publication of headlines, and the specific words that they use can be so offensive depending on who's reading it. So it is difficult. And I'm really interested in that piece, language as a cage and a tool. I mean, that's out shortly, did you say? Or
I'm writing it at the moment, so my deadline is very soon. But I actually don't know when it will be out. I assume early next year.
Right.
I have to say also, the props for the idea of language in as a cage and a tool is by this writer called Kubra Gumasay. And there's this, it's basically an amazing book called Speaking and Being, and it kind of talks about how language is a cage and a tool, and it depends on how we use it. So yeah, shout out to that because I can't copyright it for myself. I just think it's a very fab way of explaining that, like, if we don't think about language, it's a complete cage in terms of what we can do. But if you think about it in a conscious way, then you can actually use it as a tool. And in a way, it's kind of a quite obvious concept, but I just like the imagery around it because, like, being a cage is like being trapped in something. Whereas if you use a tool, you can kind of do anything. And I like that thinking.
I like that. I really look forward to reading that, and we shall share that with our listeners as well when it's available. Now, part of this podcast is about the relationship between activism and the law. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that and how activism perhaps plays a role, or a crucial role, or some sort of role in shaping the law as we have it.
Yeah, I think, well, just in relation to what we were talking about, activism in some circles has a negative connotation. And it's quite interesting because this whole activist lawyer thing has been kind of thrown around. I think it was partly when the government figures were saying, oh, we can't deal with these activist lawyers allowing people back on boats, or obviously
the immigration solicitors.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, it's kind of funny because I don't do immigration. It's like not one of my areas. So I saw it from afar, I guess. And also I don't consider myself like an activist as such, but I guess I do activist work-ish. So I can't say, I'm an activist. Like, I am a lawyer and I do work for like specific communities, which, as we've said, like, I think need, have gaps in their protections. But I do think in a broader sense, like, activism is obviously important in shaping the law. Like, I think the change doesn't happen by people being quiet and by accepting the status quo. Like, you have to shake things up, and that's what activists are not afraid to do. Like, it's a lot of work to put yourself above the kind of threshold between public and private.
Yeah.
And it's not made out for everyone. Like, I don't mind doing it and being in a public space. Like, I'm confident, as you can tell anyway, and I don't really care about people's bad opinions of me. I find it kind of funny. I'm like, if you want to join the fan club, then sure. But like, you know, I'm not here for your negative energy. I'm kind of a bit of a hippie at heart when I'm just like, okay, let's go on energy rather than you trying to slate me online. Like, I'm not here for that. But no, activism is obviously important. And I think, like, as there's more need for strategic litigation and potentially, you know, certain groups coming together and being like acting in solidarity, I think certain sides of the political coin are very good at mobilizing, and other sides end up fighting between themselves. So yeah, I think the activism, whether it's like a claimant who is bringing a case and then they're getting funded, or a lawyer taking on a case which is going to be super challenging, but then they're like, actually, there's a chance that maybe we can change the law with this, I think is so important. And I don't, you know, for me, it's like, because of my background in gender theory, and I guess just like all of my, the basis of partly why I was going into law is because I wanted to see more equal rights everywhere. I don't think it would be moral of me to not try and do these types of cases. Yeah. And, you know, I could just like skate by and just do whatever cases were given to me. Sure. You know, obviously at the bar, you have the cab rank rule. So like you take whatever case is given to you. But in my case, like I kind of like have so much work that there's a degree to which, like, because of capacity issues, like I can take on like some, you know, more than others, but it depends on my capacity. So I think if I didn't take on these difficult ones and the risky ones, then I wouldn't really be using my role as a barrister like effectively, or at least you know, to the greatest extent that I can, because it's all very well to skate along, but that's just not interesting to me, and I would get bored as well, and I would probably just want to like do something else.
Good. Well, thank goodness that you are. We spoke about your journey into law and your background there. And I'm wondering, just finally, this question that we get asked a lot about our guests. What advice would you give to individuals who wanted to follow in a similar path to yourself, especially those who are passionate about using the law to advocate for marginalised communities or follow your line of work and support your line of work, but maybe felt a little bit intimidated, or maybe felt that the legal profession might not be so welcoming to them? What kind of tips or advice can you share in terms of the challenges that you faced?
Okay, I think I've got 3 points. Classic barrister answer. My first one, which has to be the starting point, is be yourself. I know it's a well-trodden piece of advice, but I only kind of got a lot of this success because I realized there was no public non-binary barristers, and I put myself out there. Of course, I was taking a risk by doing that, and there's probably like solicitors who don't instruct me for doing that, but ultimately I don't care because I'm busy anyway. And, you know, it's like, I think that you have to be authentic to yourself, whatever that means to you, whether it's like, you know, you've got a disability and that affects the way you work. Like, you know, obviously you have to be safe, but think about whether you should disclose that or not. Or are there certain organizations that you can join within your community that really resonate with you and that kind of support you in terms of your individual identity? But yeah, I think you have to be confident enough in yourself and really almost assume all of your strengths and weaknesses, which means that play to your strengths, and your weaknesses, really, you should like work on them, try and make them less weak so that you're more of an all-round kind of package, I guess. Because I think when it comes to coming into the legal profession, it is so daunting. Like, the whole pupillage process is awful and infantilizing, and I really like send my heart out to everyone who is doing it, because it's awful and horrible. But that's not to say that you shouldn't do it. It's more just to say, you have to kind of take it with a pinch of salt.
Sure.
So that's my first point. The second is to support your community, whatever that means to you. Like for me, a lot of the really interesting work I do is because I support the local LGBTQ plus groups. I provide like free advice a lot of the time. Like when there's a trans person who's like being kicked out of their house for probably transphobic reasons, like, I'll help them and this and that. And so, if you have certain groups where you can be of assistance, which to be honest, any law person, even if you're a law student, like can be of assistance in any group. Like everyone needs lawyers. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like that, literally everyone needs lawyers. So even if you are a law, I remember when I was like in the dance scene, for example, and there was this, one of the big institutions had used my friend's image as their photo and they in one of these like ads, and they hadn't credited them at all, had no copyright. And so then I like researched the law of copyright, and then I wrote this letter and we managed to get him like £500. So, it's like you can kind of almost do the pre-lawyer stuff and test your skills and see, because ultimately it's kind of like about persuasion. Like if you can be persuasive in terms of scaring a big institution to settling and getting your friend or your community some money, then you're actually doing the lawyer stuff before you're a proper lawyer. And the third point was in terms of advice, oh my God, what was it now? Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a boring one, but if you are doing your applications, like you need to make sure you've got all of the bare minimums. And if you don't, why on earth is that a gap on your CV? So for example, in barrister terms, that usually means like a good degree, so a 2-1 or a first ideally, from like a good uni, although I know that's a bit contentious subject. The second is you have to have at least some pro bono work, whether that's working at your local citizens advice or working in the free representation unit or doing something like that. The third is you have to have some mini pupilages by the time that you apply for pupillage. Usually this is like 3 to 5. And I know obviously there's an issue in terms of like class, in terms of if you have to work full time, then it's difficult to take the time off to do these, but they only take like 2 to 3 days. So hopefully you can find the time. 4 is you have to do some mooting and ideally place in the moot and ideally be like, yeah, I want an advocacy prize, although that's obviously not always possible. And the 5th is also just like scholarships and prizes. Like they obviously love you to have scholarships and prizes. So I know that sounds like a lot, but honestly, in terms of the bar, that is the bare minimum. Like you have to have all those things pretty much to be properly considered as a candidate, because the level is so high and because there's so few places that, unless you've got all those things and you're at the stage of applying for pupillage, you may want to think twice about whether it's the right year to apply, because at least in my experience, I mean, to be fair, the caveat is I'm not on any pupillage panel or anything, but I just know from what the applications need that those are generally the things that the chambers ask for. So yeah, I think like if you are at uni, just try and make sure you're doing like work experience or something relevant all the time. Like I was at King's, I was super poor, so I had like 3 jobs on top of it. I was a waiter at the Groucho Club, so random. I was like singing, stepping, singing on Sundays, like make my dollar. And it was kind of crazy to then be trying to study and get a first and this and that. And but then I was like doing internships in, did vacation scheme and did like mini pupilages. But even when I was doing a non-law undergrad, I was still being really hyper conscious of trying to get the work experience, because I just knew that it was going to be such hard work. So by the time it came to the law conversion, which I did, and then the bar, like I'd already done like 3 law things. I'd already had loads of work experience on my CV, which obviously helps. So yeah, I think it is a difficult world out there. And I think like, props to anyone coming into the law, because it's not easy, but at the same time, it is a fulfilling job. I think it's always challenging. You're likely to be intellectually challenged a lot of the time. You can't really coast. And certainly as a barrister, like you have to hustle to make it. That's just how it is. Like if you're in chambers, you're self-employed. So you are only as successful as your kind of output, which is funny with this activist stuff, because I think it probably gets me instructions, but it also probably gets me like no instructions from certain law firms. Do you know what I mean? And that's absolutely fine, but that's kind of a risk you have to take. But ultimately you have to make yourself look attractive as an advocate, and ultimately you really want to be winning cases and doing well for your clients, and that's kind of what matters. So it's many plates to be spinning at one time.
Sure is.
But ultimately if you've got the energy and the tenacity and the willpower, like I think you've got a good chance of making it. Can't say you will make it, because then I might get in trouble or someone might sue me, but let's avoid that.
Well, I think that's one of the most both inspiring and also very practical and realistic answers that we've had to that question. And I think people will really appreciate your honesty with that, because it is difficult. There's no point in saying that it isn't. But I think what you offer there is genuine advice for anybody who's interested in following in your footsteps, or indeed getting into the legal profession as a career. Oscar Davies, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on the Activist Lawyer podcast.
Thank you. It was lovely to speak to you as well.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.